This live stream is sponsored by the Reasons to Believe Scholar community. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this special live stream. Today's conversation explores the intersection of science, philosophy, and faith, bringing together esteemed voices in the field. Dr. Fazale Rana, biochemist and president of Reasons to Believe, is joined by Dr. William A. Dembski, a mathematician, philosopher, and founder of Baylor University's Michael Polanyi Center, guided by moderator and theologian Kenneth Samples. This session is divided into 3 parts: understanding our guest's worldview, detecting intelligent design, and a Q&A portion. Today's Q&A will address critical questions. Can intelligent design be detected in nature? What are the best methods for detection? And is intelligent design a science? We're honored to have you with us for this important dialogue.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to RTB's live stream today. We've got an exciting program for you. Again, I'm Ken Samples, one of the staff scholars. We're going to be looking at the issue of detecting intelligent design, and I can't think of 2 better people to talk about this issue than our guests today. First, we have Dr. William Dembski. Bill, welcome to the program. I've read some of your books, and it's a pleasure to have you on our program today.
It's my honor and pleasure as well. Thank you, Ken.
I might say that I was very impressed with your educational background. I was tempted to say you have more degrees than a thermometer. So you come well schooled. And my good friend, Reasons to Believe biochemist, who is also the president and CEO of Reasons to Believe, we have Dr. Fazale Rana. Fuz, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Ken, and Bill. It's incredible honor to be able to share the platform with you today. So thank you for being with us, and I'm looking forward to the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so good to see you again. I know our paths have crossed over the years, so this is great.
Well, early in the show, part 1, we'll talk a little bit here about where we may agree or disagree. I like to kind of frame this discussion in terms of the Christian worldview. You can think of the Christian worldview as kind of 4 successive cosmic events: creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Bill, I know that you have your own views, but you also represent the Discovery Institute. If I ask you a question, you can speak to either one of those types of issues. But let's start with creation. When I think of a biblical view of creation, I immediately think of creation ex nihilo. Only the triune God exists. He calls all contingent realities into existence from nothing. I also think of the creation of human beings. Adam and Eve are made in the image of God. And of course, God not only creates the cosmos, but sustains it. So, Bill, where are you at on those types of issues? The discussion of Adam and Eve is somewhat controversial these days.
Right. Well, I check all the boxes that you just checked, and it's... I think Adam and Eve are historical figures. I think there was a real fall. I think the fall was a moral event, but it had affected natural evil. So I think it just had wide ramifications. Creation ex nihilo. A God who is omniscient, omnipotent. I subscribe to all of that. I mean, in full omniscience in the sense that God knows future contingent events. So I'm not an open theist. I'm not a process theist. So, I'm very, very, very traditional on these matters. I think the one thing is, I think the most natural reading of Genesis 1 and 2, or 1 through 11 even, is a young earth position. I think that's historically where the church was. I think modern science has called that into question, and that we need more age, and I think they're good scientific reasons, and I don't think they undercut any fundamental Christian doctrine. But and so I've written on that as well, why I'm an old earth creationist, I'm very traditional on this score, so
Do you have a particular interpretation of the creation days?
I guess I'm not so much day age, but I want to be careful about the literary part. I mean, I developed this in my book, The End of Christianity. I wrote it at a time when all these atheists, the four atheists of the apocalypse were writing: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. And so I was trying to wedge my way into that conversation. But the subtitle of the book is Finding a Good God in an Evil World. Wow. And I take a view that just as the salvation of Christ is not only forward-looking to the people that come after him, but also the salvation of Christ on the cross is backward-looking, in that how are the Old Testament saints saved? Well, it's by the blood of Christ on the cross. So I argue that there are retroactive effects of the fall. So in some sense, I do see those days as creative bursts, as it were, but I wouldn't go with a day age where it's like this day is now really a period of so and so many thousand years or whatever. So, and I'm, I don't know where I would come down on any details here. In fact, I see what I did in The End of Christianity as speculative theology. So I'm trying to understand this, and how do you make sense of natural evil in light of moral evil? Because that was always the very first thing that young earth creationists would say is, well, how do you get natural evil from moral evil if you have a whole history of a fossil record which speaks of death, disease, and predation? And so my argument was, well, God, as it were, creates or allows natural evil even to precede humans as a way of teaching us the consequences, the gravity of the sin of moral evil. And one argument I make there, and I don't want to get into the weeds on this, is that if indeed the world were untouched by evil prior, in terms of temporally before Adam and Eve's fall, why did God put us in a garden? Wouldn't the entire universe be a garden, really? And so why are we put into this segregated area where things are perfect? So it's an argument I make. If somebody convinces me that this is heresy and that, or that it's really misguided, I can pull away from it. But I was trying to deal with a specific theological problem of how do you make sense of natural evil in light of moral evil. And that has been the consistent teaching of the church.
Very good. Fuzz, where does RTB come down on these critical issues of creation? And talk a little bit about the fall as well, and where you interact with Bill.
Yeah, well, I think I would, again, at reasons to believe, we would affirm, the ideas that you proposed. We take I think a pretty traditional, conservative, historical view when it comes to key theological ideas, without question. One point that I would want to raise here, and I don't think that Bill would disagree with this, but that when we talk about that there's a creator that brought everything into existence, that this creator also wants to make sure that we know him, right? That he has revealed himself to us. And this is a pretty radical idea when you compare Christian theism, for example, with Islam, where God is largely unknowable in an Islamic context. So the idea of revelation is pretty radical in some respects, that this God who is transcendent wants us to know him. And one of the ways is that he has made himself known to us through what he has made. And I think this is really significant for the conversation that we're going to have about detecting design in nature, because if indeed God has revealed himself in the creation, then we would expect to see his fingerprints, and therefore we should be able to detect design, the design that we would see as good design. It also speaks, I think, to the fact that as image bearers, the universe is made intelligible to us as well, that we can study the universe and make sense of it. And again, I think this dovetails with the idea of detecting design. At least it gives a theological framework for why, as Christians, we should expect to see design that's detectable. And, I don't want to take us on a tangent here, but one of the complaints that I have with at least some versions of theistic evolution is that God is working through an evolutionary process, but his work is unknowable to us. It's hidden from us. It's taking place in the quantum indeterminacy. So God's at work, but we can't detect God at work. And I think that to me is theologically problematic. With regard to the fall, I think it would be fun to have an extended conversation with Bill on this issue. And I very much appreciate the humble approach that he's taking to his position. I'm not sure if I would agree or disagree with Bill. I think it's a very interesting idea that he proposes. But I do take the view that the fall was a real event in space and time, but that the impact was not so much on creation itself, but was on the relationship that human beings have with creation, so that we were given the instruction to be stewards of the creation as Adam and Eve and their descendants, because we bear God's image. But in a fallen state, we are unable, because that relationship now is damaged, to be proper stewards of the creation. So as a result, cursed is the earth because of us. Not that God didn't curse the earth, or that the laws of nature didn't change at the fall, but rather we're part of the original creation. It's just our relationship with the creation changed. But that means that, again, design is in principle detectable because we're not looking at a distorted or damaged or more marred creation that might hide God's fingerprints from us. But also, I think because of the fall, and this again may have bearing on our conversation, at least from a theological perspective, as fallen creatures, we don't necessarily respond appropriately to God's revelation, right? That we might choose to suppress the evidence for design. And I think this bears on the fact that sometimes people, particularly from that hold to a non-theistic position, may actually be unable to see design, but it's not because it's there, but it's rather their fallen nature.
Yeah, I mean, you're alluding to Romans 1, and I think one of the things said there, though, is that the ungodly are actually suppressing that knowledge. So it's not just that they're totally oblivious of it. I mean, there's some sort of submerged consciousness about it, but they don't want it to be the case, And so, but I think it's interesting the point you raised, though, also about, with theistic evolution, for instance, that God has hidden his tracks, but in fact, it seems that theologically we would say that God has not hidden his tracks. And then is there more than we can say about it just theologically? Is there actual evidence, scientific evidence of some sort of intelligence that would, be a fingerprint of God? I mean, that was when I was first introduced to Hugh Ross, that was his big book back in 1990. It was The Fingerprint of God, which is a terrific title.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, Bill, how would you see the idea of redemption playing into this conversation and even consummation in terms of how would you see that in terms of your own personal theological perspectives, but then how do you see that impacting the larger conversation we're going to have about design detection?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, from a materialistic or atheistic perspective, there can be no design because it's all material particles moved by blind, purposeless forces. So the role I see for intelligent design, I do see it having an apologetic role. I see it as principally a scientific claim, but because it challenges this materialistic view that there is no design, no purpose in nature, that purpose is something that emerges after an evolutionary process gives rise to people, things like us. So that's, I think it ends up, I think what intelligent design does, it's this kind of negative operation, negative in the sense of clearing away the rubble, the sorts of things that prevent people from seeing God's handiwork in creation. And so I've said that intelligent design, I see it really at three levels. One is as a scientific program looking for evidence of design that's got scientific teeth. It's a philosophical way of making sense of teleology in nature, but then also theologically, it's a bridge between science and theology that helps us make sense of God's divine agency and how we would know divine agency, or one way of knowing it. So,
well, you both have kind of touched upon that broad analogy that there are two books: the book of nature, which is a figurative book, but it represents God's creation, him in the world, along with Scripture. Let's then move on to these two questions that I think are core questions. We'll have a number of others, but obviously both of you believe in design, and you both believe that design is detectable. Bill, I'm going to offer that next question to you. What is the best method for detecting design?
Right. Well, I think you need to draw a distinction first off. If it's a matter of detecting design because you actually see the designer active in front of you, you're detecting design, but there's not much of a method that's called for. I mean, if you see somebody building an arrowhead, chipping away at flint and then creating an arrowhead, you're dealing with a human, an agent, an intelligence, and then you see an arrowhead. The question arises, what happens if you just find something that looks like an arrowhead? How do you know that it is the result of an intelligence? So I mean, the first instance was really cause to effect reasoning. You know a cause, you see the cause operating, you know that the cause has the causal power to bring about the arrowhead. The other is you see the effect, and then you have to reason back to the cause. So that's where it becomes interesting, I would say, with design detection or design inferences. And I would say, when you say methods, it seems to me there's really only one method, and I would approach it by just going back to first principles. And I think an example that I will use, I think, to really illustrate this, because it doesn't get you into all the controversy about biology, but it also is, I think, quite revealing. And this is SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So imagine, you're a SETI researcher. You're not in the position of ET, where ET comes, the little green guy comes to Earth, and you see what he or it is doing. So what are you getting? You're getting signals, radio signals from outer space, and let's just assume they're bits, zeros and ones. So what would tell you that you're dealing with an intelligence? So imagine, for instance, you have an alien intelligence that has, triangulated on planet Earth and is saying, I want to get this signal to them, and so for some reason, like in Star Trek, they all speak English, and so, we get this signal which says, a glorious day has come in the meeting of our two civilizations. We've finally established contact, and just expatiates on from there. But the thing is, as the person put, the very first thing, a glorious day, the letter A, let's say, and it's done in Unicode or ASCII or some, 8 bits, which represent the letter A. That's the only thing that comes in. Okay. After that, the person had a heart attack or a brain seizure, and the rest of the message didn't go through, or it got diverted in some way. So that letter A was intelligently produced. Okay. But could you detect design in it? Well, no, you couldn't, because if you're monitoring millions, billions of radio channels, you'll see any sequence of 8 bits, not just once, but over and over again. So what does that tell you? You need complexity. You need a lot of bits if you're going to be convinced. So you're going to need to see not just A, the indefinite article, but a glorious day has appeared in the, with our civilizations and so on. And so you're going to need to have a fair amount of text, as it were. I mean, and it's similar with plagiarism, right? I mean, you need a fair amount of text in order to determine whether somebody is plagiarized. So similarly here, So now if you have that, that's complexity. That's a lot of bits. That lot of bits corresponds to an improbability. Now, usually we go with uniform probabilities. We don't have to, but let's just, for simplicity, do that. So you're going to have a lot of bits that corresponds to an improbability. If you've got 10 bits, that's 1/2 times 1/2, 10 times, or about 1 in 1,000. If you've got 20 bits, that's about 1 in 1,000,000 improbability. If you've got 100 bits, that's about 1 in 10 to the 30, the probability. So complexity and probability end up being equivalent notions. So you need either complexity of bits or improbability. Okay, so it seems to me, and I'm just going on first principles. If you're going to figure out, if you're going to have a signal that convinces you from outer space that you're dealing with an intelligence, that you're going to need that. That's a necessary condition. But it's not a sufficient condition because, there's a lot of random radio noise. You're going to have lots of different types of bits coming in. So in addition, you're going to need a recognizable pattern. Oh, this is English in ASCII code or Unicode saying a glorious day has arrived, etc. So a recognizable pattern plus improbability, that's what seems to triangulate on intelligent design. That's the method. So the question, though, is, okay, complexity or improbability, that's got a well-established mathematical theory, probability theory or Shannon information. So the question then is, well, what makes something recognizable? And the easiest way to deal with that mathematically is through something called Kolmogorov complexity or algorithmic information theory. And the idea is that if you can compress something, if you can make it short, give it a short description, that tends to be recognizable. So if you get a glorious day has arrived, etc., oh, that's an English message, that's appropriate to this context. Now, there could be lots of messages that would be appropriate, but even the entire range of those messages in English would be minuscule compared to all the gibberish that could be produced. So got a short description. Oh, this is an English message, and it's highly improbable. So in this case, the improbability has to apply to not just that specific message, but the English messages that might be produced randomly. And when you have that convergence of improbability and recognizability, or what I call specification in that case, so the specifications are these patterns that can be described succinctly, compressed, and then you've got the improbability. So you end up getting what we call then specified complexity. It's not just brute complexity. If I take 1,000 marbles, throw them on the floor, and it's just a random arrangement, you've got complexity, but you don't have anything that's recognizable. But if it says, welcome to RTB headquarters, you'll know, because that's got you can describe that very succinctly. You'll know that you're dealing with an intelligence. So I would say it's, what I've just done is go through very quickly this method, but I would say it's works. I mean, I think I've given really, they're both jointly, they're necessary conditions, and it seems that they are also sufficient. Now,
okay,
we can argue about that, but that's the method, I would say.
Very good. Fuzz, your thoughts about this topic?
Yeah, well, and I'm going to approach it maybe from a different perspective, maybe not so much from first principles, but maybe more from perhaps a top-down approach. But I would argue that definitely design is detectable, and I think this is true scientifically, even though theologically I would anticipate design being detectable in nature. I would argue scientifically, and my argument would be, as Bill mentioned, SETI is a scientific discipline in which design detection is very much an integral part of that work, where SETI researchers are claiming they can determine whether or not an intelligent civilization or a natural process generated electromagnetic radiation from a distant object. But there's other disciplines that are involved in design detection. Archaeology is an example, and that's where I probably have my greatest familiarity. Is people working in the hominin archaeological record can pick up rocks and examine them and determine, okay, this was shaped by natural processes, or this was shaped by deliberate action of a hominin, of an intelligent agent, right? And the same thing is true with crime scene investigation. There's a very interesting example of design detection that is involved in the debate about the origin of the SARS-2 coronavirus. Was it lab made? Was it a zoonotic transfer, or some combination of both? And what I've done is I've studied how people are reasoning and arguing for design in these different disciplines. And what I see is commonality. And I see them essentially trying to satisfy three criteria, and then really arguing for, involved in abductive reasoning. What's the best explanation? And the first thing is, to use a term from SETI, is they look for artificiality, or you might say design. The second prong in that analysis would be, is there a natural process that can produce this particular feature that we see? And then finally, what does it take to go into a laboratory and create that artifact? Or that's experimental archaeology. Or in the case of SETI, a lot of times it's a theoretical analysis of, is it possible to produce that kind of unnatural signal, if you will? So A.V. Loeb's work is really very interesting in terms of thinking through what he's doing to make a case for, again, these, extra or these interstellar objects that are coming into our solar system that are actually alien artifacts. I don't know that I would agree with him, but his reasoning is very interesting. And so, now what I've done is, I've looked at that criteria and have applied it to biochemical systems. And biochemical systems, basically are able to run the gauntlet. They do display design. They do you can't explain them with regard to evolutionary processes. This is the origin of life problem. And then finally, we are now working on creating artificial cells in a laboratory, and we can show that activity requires, the best minds in the world to execute it. It's empirical evidence that design is needed to affect even a crude protocell. So to me, that's a more qualitative set of criteria that allows, I think, us to argue, A, that design is part of the scientific construct. I don't think anybody would question if these are scientific endeavors, and B, that it lays out a roadmap for how we might go about arguing for design. Now, the one place where I think there's a weakness in this approach is, what do you mean by artificiality? And this is where I think the ideas that Bill is bringing to the table about specified complexity become really very important, because what he's doing is providing, I think, some rigor to how you would go about positively determining that this actually is a design feature, right? That it does display genuine artificiality. But there's other people that have worked in this area too. I think Marcus Eblin's foresight, of course, Michael Behe's irreducible complexity, Doug Axe's idea of functional coherence. And in my book, The Cell's Design, I take a kind of a modern day watchmaker approach. I think these are all different ways that we could go about arguing that what we're looking at least in my example, in biochemical systems, truly is artificial. So, but I'd be curious to see Bill's thoughts on that particular approach to detecting design, really modeling it after what people in these disciplines are doing.
Yeah.
Let me get both of you to react to this quote. It's from Bill Gates. He says, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. I mean, if I, to use a story, if I saw SOS on the sand, I immediately would think, well, this is a code. The DNA code is incredibly complex. Bill and Fuzz, what do you think of Gates's statement there?
I'm, I'm not sure I see a Turing machine inside cells. I mean, I think there's a lot of really cool digital stuff going on there. So, I'm sympathetic to what he says, but for the hardcore Darwinists, such as a Richard Dawkins, that poses no threat because, he takes the view that evolution is this complexity building process, and you can always take things back to some sort of, he'll use the phrase primordial simplicity, and then evolution will just kind of bootstrap you up there. So, so yes, we have something that gives all appearance of design. In fact, that's the very first, on the very first page of Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And it's the appearance of design, And I think this is where, I think in part what motivates me to focus on this idea of specified complexity, because I don't think it doesn't build in a design as a presupposition, which I think is what critics would argue, that if you have, you don't want to be begging the question about design, and so specified complexity doesn't build that in. But I think it's compatible with the sort of qualitative criteria that Fuzz was looking at, and I think in practice, I would say we are in very good intuitive design theorists or design detectors. Detectives have worked and are able to work without my design explanatory filter. They figured it out for themselves. And yet, what I see myself doing is providing, if you will, a rational reconstruction, or trying to get to the logical underpinnings of what they're actually doing. So I don't see any real contradiction with anything we're saying here. But I think at the end of the day, if we're going to argue this on scientific grounds, I think Bill Gates, I don't think he's, to my understanding, he's not a design guy. He's it seems like he's a World Economic Forum guy. And, one of the big guys there is Yuval Harari, who is thoroughly materialist in his understanding of life and humanity. I think Bill Gates has a nice blurb for his book. So, the day Bill Gates gives a nice blurb for my book, I may change my tune.
Fuzz, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'm sympathetic to the point that Bill's making, that, it seems like it's more something that Bill Gates is stating just to be a bit dramatic. But I actually would argue, Bill, that are Turing machines inside the cell. In fact, this was an insight from Leonard Adelman, who is a computer scientist at the University of Southern California. And he recognized that the cell's machinery that manipulates DNA are literally operating as biochemical Turing machines, where the digital data going in and out would be the DNA strands, and the enzymes would be the finite control. And that when you look at a process like DNA replication, it's really an ensemble of these biochemical Turing machines that are working together to carry out, in effect, what's a computer operation. And so when Adelman had this aha moment, he actually is considered the father of DNA computing, where he and people that are following after him are building these DNA computers using DNA and the enzymes that are found inside cells. And there's a whole host of operations they've designed that you can then combine to create computer programming. And because of the massive parallelism when you're dealing with DNA, these systems can actually solve problems that traditional silicon-based computers can't solve. So when I see something like the fact that the metabolic processes involving DNA are in essence literally computer operations, that to me screams of design. I'm not sure how you would necessarily quantify that. And this is where I think something like the watchmaker approach is helpful to articulate why this appears to be bona fide design. But there's other things that are intriguing. There's a guy named Donald McDonnell at Trinity University in Dublin, who argues that there's an even bit parity code instantiated within DNA, and this is actually creates a distortion in the DNA double helix that allows DNA repair enzymes to recognize damage in DNA. And recently, good grief, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name. Kevin Mitchell wrote an article with a computer scientist whose name escapes me, who argued that actually the genome in complex multicellular organisms is really a generative AI system, and presented a really interesting argument along those lines. But when you see those kinds of things, while they're much more sophisticated than I think Bill Gates's statement, but they are suggesting that there's a deeper similarity, I think, between computer systems and the AI systems that we're designing, and the DNA and the metabolic processes and the cell's machinery that's manipulating DNA. And so I'm not sure how you would necessarily quantify that design, but it seems like, again, intuitively it looks designed. And so I think the watchmaker approach is a really nice way to be able to give a little bit more rigor to arguing that this truly is displays design, or displays an artificiality to it.
Yeah. Well, and I think I misspoke. I mean, in the sense that, clearly if you've got digital stuff going on, you can simulate or emulate with some Turing machine, some computational process. So it does seem that you could do that. But as I read Bill Gates's quote, I'm thinking really more of a universal Turing machine where you've got an operating system. What is the operating system? Mm-hmm. What is the processor on which it's running? You do have all these kind of pieces of computation that seem to be going on. But in terms of something that's just a unified computational system that's operating as a universal Turing machine, where you've got clearly can identify, okay, what's the operating system here? I think there's a disanalogy with so that's really what I was thinking about. But with what Bill Gates is saying, but in terms of Shannon communication diagrams, you've got error correction, you've got all these things that are going on, that we've developed in software engineering that we see inside the cell. So I take the analogy with computation seriously. I know that certainly evolutionary computing is a big deal, although that's mainly happening in silico. And then you've got also computational biology, which is a big deal these days. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to give the impression that computation and what's going on in the cell are vastly different things, but I think there are tight connections, and yet the sort of claim that I see Bill Gates making is, I don't see the cell as my laptop here with an operating system running. It seems that there's much more going on, and there's also truth be told, I have certain vitalistic tendencies, and I don't think that all the information that's being expressed in the cell is encoded in its materiality, if you will. Just as I don't think that everything that's expressed through human beings is somehow encoded or instantiated in their material constitution and dynamics. We have access to the mind of God. We are, there's a spiritual dimension, and that dimension impacts us and makes a real difference that's not reducible to our material constitution. So that's something I'm committed to. I think, somebody like Nancy Murphy would say we don't have a soul and might reject that, but I think from my vantage, it seems that we have a world that's porous to information from a transcendent source. And that, to me, that can happen even at the cellular level, which means that, sort of a computational reductionism, even at the level of the cell, becomes questionable if my intuitions there are right.
Let me jump in. I want to remind our listeners that you can submit your questions in just a few minutes. We're going to open it up to questions. So get them in there. Fuzz, I wonder if we could move to a second question here. And that is intelligent design a science? Why don't you address that, and then we'll go to Bill.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely think design detection is a science, and hence intelligent design, is a scientific program. I think it's very much part of the construct of science. At Reasons to Believe, we take the view that we're not just simply looking to see design in nature, but we want to understand what is the source of that design. And so, we've created and built and constructed a creation model where design detection becomes a very critical aspect of supporting that creation model. But the model is meant to tell an overarching narrative or story about the origin and the design of the universe, and the origin and the design of life, and including the origin of humanity, and the future of humanity. So we're presenting a creation model where I see design detection as being really in service to this. And I think this would be analogous to what you see as really the evolutionary paradigm, where there is a story that's being told, from an evolutionary perspective about the origin and the design and the history of life, where things like natural selection and sexual selection and even chemical evolution are all, playing a mechanistic role in supporting that grand narrative. So I would probably approximately position intelligent design in the same place I would position maybe natural selection with respect to the evolutionary narrative in terms of how we would view the creation model. But I definitely see intelligent design as very much a scientific program, right? And it just, I think it needs to be also be functioning in service to a larger model.
Bill, I was reading the Wikipedia article about you, and I noticed that it was very quick to say that, he engages in the pseudoscience of intelligent design. Do you think that intelligent design is a science?
Oh, absolutely. But I think you omitted last reading of that first sentence where they try to just pack in every derogatory they can. I think they also got in that I'm a creationist. Well, I am an old Earth creationist, on theological terms, but I think they're very much committed to conflating creationism with design, and they're connections, but they're also differences. I mean, the way to illustrate the difference is there's a joke: scientists come to God and say, we can do everything you can do. God says, oh, that's interesting, show me. They say, well, we can build humans from scratch. We just take some dirt, and then God says, wait a second, get your own dirt. And so the point being that creation is always a doctrine of the ultimate source of things. Where do things come from? Design, on the other hand, looks at pre-existing materials and says, what about their arrangement, their function, their dynamics? What would tell us that we're dealing with intelligence? So, so I think if we just leave aside biology and cosmology, of course, intelligent design is a science. I mean, forensic science is an intelligent design science. Mm-hmm. Archaeology is. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The list goes on. So the problem is that I think when we're talking the natural sciences have this built-in bias toward something sometimes called methodological naturalism, methodological atheism, methodological materialism. But the idea is that in order to do science, you have to assume that at the nuts and bolts level of science, chemistry, physics, there is no teleology, there's no intelligence, there's no purpose. It's just blind matter in motion according to fixed, unbreakable, unbroken natural laws. And if that's where things start, then in a sense you have baked in non-design from the start, because the only way you get design out of that is through an evolutionary process that produces beings, animals that demonstrate design, that can do things that are designed. But if you don't make that assumption, then I think all bets are off. Then why not just say that there could be intelligence? And then if there are these tools, these methods for identifying intelligence, which work in other fields, other special sciences of intelligent design, then why not in biology? Why not in cosmology? So what stands in the way? And I would say what stands in the way is ideology. It's not following the evidence where it leads. And I think this is very convenient on the part of the atheists, because they're committed to making this a science versus religion controversy. 200 years ago, if you were a minister, that was the highest place in society. These days, that's not the case. It's the scientist who has the commanding heights, and so that's what we're dealing with. And so what intelligent design is doing is shifting that conversation and saying it's not a science versus religion. It's a science versus science controversy, and you need to take this seriously. Now, how it becomes science, I think Fuzz mentioned, for instance, abduction or inference to the best explanation. I think there's you can make a case that design explains certain biochemical structures of the sort that Fuzz has analyzed. I think you can make a case at the level of cosmology of the sort that Hugh Ross has made. So there are these abductive approaches. But then I think there's also just, this methodology of specified complexity, where we have these criteria which seem, I would argue that it's reliably identifies the effects of intelligence. It depends. You've got to put the right numbers in. If you get the numbers wrong, then what you get out will be wrong. But it's interesting also, Fuzz, that you brought up natural selection, that design detection and design plays a similar role, on the opposite side of things, of course. But I would say for the Darwinists, natural selection is a designer substitute. It's how they get all this design. If you read Richard Dawkins, that's cumulative selection, natural selection. That's how you get all this nifty stuff. So it's but question then is, can natural selection do all of that creative work? And if it's a science, there has to be evidence for and against. You can't just say that, it has to be that way because, science has to follow methodological naturalism, and so natural selection is the only game in town. Richard Dawkins has actually said that, where even if there were no evidence for it, natural selection would still be the best explanation. It's like it, but then he adds parenthetical. Of course, there is evidence for it, but so I think what we're doing is we're holding people's feet to the fire, and we're saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If there can, if intelligent design is falsifiable, if it's a matter of scientific testing, then so is natural selection, and we need to try to pair these off and see, where does the preponderance of evidence lie? And, from vantage of my colleagues and me, we've got the better argument. But, having the better argument is not always, doesn't always win the day. There's one of my favorite cartoons in the New Yorker shows an attorney talking to a prospective client, and the attorney says, "You've got an excellent case, Mr. Pitkin. Now, how much justice can you afford?" And I think that becomes the issue often. You can have great ideas and arguments, but then you've got to still get them out there. And in a very hostile sort of environment, which we face in the academy, it's overwhelmingly materialist, the secular academy, and much of the Christian academy is thoroughly methodologically naturalistic. It's what you were speaking to at the start, Fuzz, where God is hidden in his tracks. We can't know that he is on any sort of scientific grounds that he has interacted with the world. It becomes a pure faith move. And if you can live that way, if you can nurture a good faith with that, well, good luck to you. But I think a lot of people, they lose their faith when they are confronted with the prospect of science having shown that God is unnecessary. And if you've looked at Lee Strobel's Case for the Creator, his video, he describes how when he was exposed to the Miller-Urey experiment at age 14 in high school, he lost his faith because it was like, well, God was no longer necessary. That's why somebody like Will Provine, former historian of science or historian of biology at Cornell, would write, evolution is the greatest engine for atheism ever devised. I think there's reason that Richard Dawkins is the best known atheist in the English-speaking world, and that he's an evolutionary biologist. But anyway, I could keep this rant going, but I'm just
okay. Fuzz, you can respond to some of that if you'd like. I would like you and Bill to maybe answer the question, what do you think is the best example of intelligent design? Then kind of flip that. What do you think the best criticism is against intelligent design? But feel free to respond to Bill.
No, I don't think I'm going to be. I would wholeheartedly concur with virtually everything that Bill said in terms of why is intelligent design just simply dismissed, particularly in the academy. But for me, as a biochemist, what I see to be the most remarkable example of design would be the structure of the genetic code. And here I'm not referring to the information in DNA, but rather the set of rules that's involved in translation, where the information in DNA and RNA is translated into the information in proteins. That set of rules, the genetic code, is unbelievably remarkable in terms of its structure. Number one, the fact that it's a code in and of itself is provocative because our common experience is codes come from minds. But when we look at in detail at the structure of the code, there's a redundancy to the code, but that redundancy creates this multidimensional optimization where the genetic code is optimized to minimize the harmful effects of substitution mutations, frame shift mutations. It allows for an optimized overlapping genes. It allows for other codes to be embedded within DNA, in addition to the genetic code, which specifies amino acids and proteins. And these additional codes, there's a handful of them, are all involved in gene expression. And then finally, the code is even optimized for resource conservation. And that's a bit of a complex discussion, but this optimization has been demonstrated mathematically by a number of researchers. It's to the point now where people would argue that it's non-controversial, I should say, that the code is actually optimized. And the big question is, to what degree is it optimized, and can we explain that optimization from an evolutionary vantage point? And in my assessment of the attempts to account for that optimization through evolutionary mechanisms falls way short. So I just see that as perhaps the most compelling evidence for design. If that was the only example of intelligent design that I saw in biochemistry, I would be convinced that there must be a creator behind life. And part of the reason is the genetic code, in effect, is really what is at the core of biochemistry. It's what defines biochemistry in its essence, is that set of rules.
Bill, kind of keep it a little short, but what do you think is the best and maybe the biggest challenge to ID?
Yeah, well, let me just say, I mean, Fuzz beat me to the punch because that would have been my example, and I would just add, it's remarkable to me that the whole idea of a code, a code is not just a symbol convention where you're writing things on a sheet of paper from some fixed alphabet or something. It's a translation scheme from one symbol convention to another. And this was at the heart of Shannon's 1948-49 work on his theory of communication. And then 4 years later or so, Watson and Crick discover the structure of DNA as this helix. And then within 10 years, they know that they're dealing with a code, So it's like the mathematics comes first, and then we see, oh, we've got this mathematics in the cell itself. So to me, that's just remarkable. And, there's no, one of the key examples that intelligent design guys have used is the bacterial flagellum, a little bidirectional motor-driven propeller that propels bacteria through their watery environment. But bacteria can do without bacterial flagella. They don't have to be mobile that way. But no living thing can do without this full set of machinery, this code that's there. And it's immensely complicated. I mean, you need all sorts of proteins to access it. You need ribosomes, which are immensely complicated in themselves, to bring what's implicit in the DNA to life. So, there's no simplification. No, you can get rid of this and still be alive. You get rid of it and you're dead, and then you're not a viable candidate for evolution. So that's, I think, so I find it immensely compelling. So there's no gradual route to it. Nothing that we know. I mean, I've heard of 2 codon codes, but I mean, that's just pure speculation. So in terms of the greatest challenge, I think it's more on the edges. I don't think it's at the fundamental level of the types of complexities that we're seeing. I think it's, what actually happened in the history of life? How much evolution happened? How much, how much special creation may there have been? So I think there are historical questions, and then I think just getting clearer on, the precise design characteristics. But in all the years that I've been doing this, it's never that I've found some result that seems to be a complexity producing engine that somehow invalidates anything we've done on intelligent design. If anything, the problems just seem to keep getting worse. We find higher orders, more nested complexities, things that just make the design, if anything, more impressive and harder for these material mechanisms to reach. So
I want to move to the questions that we have coming in. And again, we've got room, so submit your question. Fuzz, before we do that, I want you to respond. When I have talked to theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists, they seem very critical and dismissive of intelligent design. Why is that?
My sense is that some of it is a desire to appear credible, and these are harsh words in some respects, and so I say this with some measure of caution. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of it is a desire to remain and appear credible with respect to the mainstream scientific framework, because intelligent design is thoroughly thoroughly teleological in nature, where if you're positing design that's intentional, that's coming from an agent of some sort, then there must be a purpose to life. There must be an undergirding teleology, and evolutionary theory is thoroughly anti-teleological in nature. This was the Darwinian revolution. Darwin stripped design, he stripped purpose, he stripped teleology from the life sciences. And so I think it's safe to say, I think God created through an evolutionary process where God's work is invisible. That is a safe position to take as a Christian who is interested in gaining the approval of the academy. But I think at the end of the day, that would be my assessment. It's a bit cynical. I recognize it's going to be viewed by some people as an inflammatory comment, but I think that is the ultimate motivation. I don't think it's the evidence, because it's very clear that when you look at, for example, even the origin of life, that there's no naturalistic, mechanistic explanation for the origin of life, and there's key transitions in life's history. Bill's colleague Steve Meyer writes about what happens at the Cambrian explosion and in the origin of body plans, with this massive infusion of information that's needed to go from a single-celled organism to a complex multicellular organism. These are really significant problems that a strict evolutionary framework it faces in terms of trying to account for the origin of in the history of life through evolutionary means. So these are legitimate places where I think Christians who believe that there's a creator that's revealed himself should at least be open to saying this really is a place where perhaps there was a creator's involvement. But I think it's safe to label intelligent design as pseudoscience and embrace the mainstream narrative.
Let's move then to some questions that have come in. I want you to keep your answers as brief as you can so we can get through a lot of these. So we're moving to part 3 of our program. Bill, the first question is for you. It is from JT, a member of our scholar community. He says, how is ID's mathematical method for detecting design in nature applicable to, say, detecting the Mount Rushmore was designed?
Yeah, well, we actually do a calculation in the second edition of Design Inference, and we this is my colleague Winston Ewart is my co-author on that. And what we do is actually we contrast the specificity of Mount Rushmore with if you have ever seen the old Mars face, there was this image on Mars which looked like a face. I think it's since eroded away. But you can just look at facial characteristics and you can quantify just how specific some things are. And so we do a calculation. Now, is that calculation, does it exactly capture what's there? It's, I think it illustrates how these methods can be applied, and I think we are able, at least convincingly, to draw a distinction why the Mars face is not convincingly designed, and whereas Mount Rushmore is. But you're going to have to. I mean, you can think of it as, there are patterns that we're finding in nature, and then we have to start getting estimates of the complexities involved there, the improbabilities. And usually it's not just a single pattern, it's a variation. Fuzz will appreciate this. Usually it's not just a single protein, but amino acids in a protein allow many different variants. And so you have to factor all of those in. Well, similarly, we have to factor in other variants of possible faces, but still where you've got a certain level of detail. And, that's what we do. So I would encourage you look at chapter 6 of the second edition of Design Inference. It came out in 2023. Truth be told, I'm not entirely convinced of the calculation. It's like as though that's going to nail it down for anybody. But there are instances where these calculations apply with much more, I think, cogency. Where you can, for instance, I think with Mount Rushmore, what are the precise numbers there? But with the genetic code, there are 4 possibilities. They're the codons. There are ways of mathematizing this and getting some good estimates on the complexities. I think Doug Axe has done something like that, and actually in the follow-up chapter 7 in the Design Inference second edition, we look at that. So anyway, I don't want to go on too long because you told us not to.
Okay. Fuzz, here's a question from Rob. Since design arguments often fail because critics claim nature only has the appearance of design, what kind of evidence or agreed definition of a divine fingerprint would actually move the discussion forward?
Yeah, well, I think to Rob's point, the work that Bill's doing, that other people are doing, in terms of trying to come up with criteria for detecting design is specifically the idea of trying to distinguish between apparent design and authentic design, right? And I think there are, again, as we've discussed, different ways that you could approach this whole question of how do you show that something is definitely authentic design? But I think part of it also is looking to rule out natural process explanations, because it's one thing to claim something has the appearance of design, but you have to be able to show that the mechanisms you have available to you can actually produce that type of a design system. And this is something that Bill mentioned earlier about natural selection. Is it truly capable of producing the type of design that you see in biological systems? I don't think the answer is yes to that whatsoever. But so to me, it's a combination of being able to make a positive, rigorous case that this really does have the appearance of bona fide design. You would also want to, I think, show that it's unreasonable to think that this could actually come about through the mechanisms available. And then finally, I think there's value in at least some areas of science being able to try to show what would it take to actually produce that design. So with regard to a biochemical system, what the work that's being done in synthetic biology pretty much has shown that you're not just going to throw a bunch of chemicals into a test tube and shake it up and out pop these biochemical systems. Rather, they're constructed through very laborious and rather ingenious strategies on the part of some of the best minds in the world. So that to me is empirically evidence that intelligent agency is necessary, or at least it raises further questions about natural process mechanisms explaining that design. So this is, in a sense, this is the conversation that Bill and I are having today, is how do you make that discrimination? But I think there are ways to do that.
If I could just jump in, because
sure.
If you did have a test tube with random chemicals, and then you come back sometime later and you found that there was some cell in it, I don't think your conclusion would be, oh, isn't it amazing what this random chemistry could do? You'd either say there was some sort of contamination, or there was some super genius molecular biologist who worked with those materials. Yeah. So you wouldn't even draw that conclusion, that if you saw this before and after, you'd think that there was an intelligence.
John, he says, would intentional design be a better label than intelligent design? Would there be a difference in demonstrating intention versus intelligence? He says that courts deal with intention.
Yeah, I wouldn't be a fan of that, because it seems to me we can tell we're dealing with intelligent design even when we don't know the intention. There are artifacts that we know are the result of intelligence. I think there was this Antikythera machine that was discovered, I think, at the bottom of the Mediterranean. I'm not sure if I got the pronunciation right, but I think now people think that that's some sort of orrery, some sort of device for describing the heavens. But I'm told there was a room at the Smithsonian Institution of obviously designed artifacts where people had no idea what they did. I remember a friend of mine in high school, his father was a butcher. He had a machine from Germany. Could never figure out what it was, had people come through, but it was obviously a machine. So I think intelligent design, I think it does work that the intention doesn't, because often we don't know what the intention is. I would say also there's a reason for putting intelligent in front of design. It might seem redundant, but it's precisely because the evolutionists will argue that it's only an appearance of design. And Richard Dawkins has even talked about designoids as things that appear to be designed but are not. So intelligence basically just emphasizes that there's a real intelligence involved there.
We're experiencing a little bit of feedback, and our guys are trying to correct that. Fuzz, let me direct this question to you, and then of course I want to hear Bill's response as well. Some people would criticize the Discovery Institute or intelligent design because they don't specifically identify the creator. I think Bill said, look, could be aliens. Is this a difference between intelligent design and maybe RTB's point of view, that we do identify the God of the Bible? And certainly I know Bill believes that, but what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's perhaps the maybe one of the bigger differences between Reasons to Believe and let's say the Discovery Institute. But I think the objectives of the two organizations are very different. Reasons to Believe is, an organization that exists to open people to the gospel by revealing God and science. So of course we're going to make an argument that the designer is the God of the Bible. That's not the objective of the Discovery Institute. And so I think that's really the difference. It's a difference in what is the intention of the organization, what's the purpose of the organization. Now, and I would be interested in hearing Bill's response, because I believe, and this is maybe more natural theology than it is anything else, but I actually believe that through the detection of design in nature, that there are times where we can, I would agree with Bill's greatest distinction between intentional design and intelligent design. That was very good. But I do think there are instances where we can discern intention of the designer. And, I think we can also get an idea of what that designer's capability is. So, for example, in archaeology, if you're working with an artifact produced by a hominin, anthropologists are very quick to try to assess what is the manual dexterity, what is the motivation of the hominin, what is the cognitive capacity of the hominin that would produce these types of artifacts. But from our perspective too, we would argue that when you look at the totality of the scientific package, well, you could make an argument that the universe has a beginning. And if there's a beginning, that means there's a transcendent cause. We're talking about design in the cosmos, design in living systems. Design comes from intentionality. So right away, it looks like you're dealing with a transcendent personality that is responsible for that design. So that would be an example of where I think you could use the science to go a little bit further and say, this is something about the designer. But we do that at Reasons to Believe because that's our mission. It's not the mission of the Discovery Institute. So I think I wouldn't expect them to do that, given what I understand to be their purpose. We do that at Reasons to Believe because that's our mission.
Yeah.
The mission of the Discovery Institute. So I think I wouldn't expect them to do
Do you want me to speak to that, or I hear a little bit of echo in the back?
I think I would like to hear your
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, I don't think intelligent space aliens.
Go ahead, Bill.
So
Bill.
I would like to hear your
yeah, sure. So I don't think intelligent space aliens created life on Earth. I think it's the God the Father, of Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. So I don't, I'm not ashamed of my Christian faith in this matter. I think one of the issues, though, with Discovery Institute is also the idea of how far can these arguments, simply based on the science, go. And one way I've illustrated this is, if you have a balance, and you have the weight is down here, you've got something that's up, and let's say they're 10 pounds here, and you've got a veil in front of where the weight is down. How much weight is down here? Well, it's at least 10 pounds, but is it 100 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 1,000,000 pounds? An infinite number of pounds? You really can't know. So I think that's one of the issues with intelligent design. When you look at finite material objects and their structure, what can you infer about the designer? And I don't think you can get to an infinite, personal, transcendent creator God from finite material objects. I think this is the point that Immanuel Kant made in his critique of pure reason. That you just can't get there. But, as a matter of Christian faith, that can bridge the gap. And, most of my colleagues at Discovery Institute, not all of them, are Christians, and it's, you think about Steve Meyer's latest book, Return of the God Hypothesis, so he is actually talking about God and not just a generic designer, so it's, I think there's, I think we're very friendly. I think we're trying, if anything, to strengthen the hands of people like yourselves, at Reasons to Believe. But I think we see our task, as you, Fuzz, said it, a bit different. And I think that also helps us in the types of arguments and the people that we're engaging. I mean, you think, William Paley's blind watchmaker argument, it's probably the best known still to this day watchmaker or design argument. In his book, Natural Theology, the longest chapter is at the end where he's trying to deal with, some of the problems in nature. But at the end of the day, he argues that really the world is pretty close to an English garden where things are in their place. When organisms die, it's really not too bad. They die pretty quickly, and it's a world that's not too tragic. Now, Darwin turned this on its head. I mean, he looked at this Ichneumonidae wasp and said, you have this wasp that lays its eggs in a caterpillar, keeps it alive so that it has a fresh supply of food, and then bursts out of it, kind of like in the movie Aliens, the guy Bob bursts out of this person's stomach. So he looked at that and said, it's just monstrous. So you do have a problem of evil, natural evil, and I think we're able to skirt that to some degree because we're concerned, is there design at all? So once you start bringing in a full Christian theology, then you have a lot more to deal with, a lot more to defend. And I think it's important to defend that. But I think it's a different, I think as the Apostle Paul put it, there are lots of members to the body, and so we just have different tasks, different things that we need to do.
Okay, another question here from Dan. What do you see as the end game of searching for ID? Is the end of ID to show that there is purpose to our existence? For SETI, there is the underlying idea that making contact would give us insight into how to get past the existential threats. Bill or Fuzz?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I don't think the end game is just to find purpose. It's, I think theology gives us plenty of grounds to think that there's purpose, as does philosophy. It seems to me that what's intelligent design, if it is fully successful, is going to give us if you will, an engineering or bioengineering model, if we're looking at biology, of what we're dealing with in biology, trying to get insights and use those insights of intelligent design by examining systems, finding their design characteristics, and getting just understanding the world as God created it that much better from a scientific vantage. It seems to me that the problem with Darwinian evolution is that it is so completely wrong, that it's giving us a faulty understanding of nature and how biological complexity arose. So can we understand that better? And in understanding it better, do we get inspiration, from biology for our own inventions? And the thing is, that happens, biomimetics, the whole, can we imitate what we find in biology? There are technologies in biological systems that far outstrip anything that humans have come up with. So, so I think it's much more gaining a true understanding of life, the cosmos, and then putting to rest these sorts of unsubstantiated just so stories about how mindless material processes could bring about the sort of complexity that in any other context we would ascribe to a super intellect.
Fuzz, here's a question. Could common descent actually be better explained as common design? What do you think about that? I know you studied Paley. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that would be exactly my position, is that, one of the most often cited evidences for an evolutionary history of life would be the shared biological designs among organisms that naturally group together. But prior to Darwin, Sir Richard Owen saw these shared features as reflecting an archetype that existed in the mind of a creator. And so he saw the archetype arising from a first cause. And in fact, writes that he sees the idea that you could have an archetype that could be so robust to be varied in such a way to create a wide range of functional structures as being the ultimate expression of design, that you could have form and function working in a collaborative framework to produce this wide range of biological diversity. And so prior to Darwin, people, I think, viewed biological systems in a design-oriented framework. And so one of the things that I think is perhaps missing to some degree in I would just say in the work of everybody that is taking part in this whole design project is, thinking about form as being part of that design as well as function, right? And so this, I think, is the contribution of Sir Richard Owen. And so it's interesting to me that you could go back prior to Darwin within the history of science and see again shared features in terms of design. And so I see common design and common descent as at least at first approximation equivalent explanations, but common design, of course, is ruled out a priori for reasons that Bill pointed out because of this deep-seated commitment to methodological naturalism. And if you're talking about an archetypical design, you are now encroaching on the territory of teleology as well, which is forbidden territory in mainstream biology.
Question here for you, Bill, from Dennis. I think Dr. Dembski said intelligent design is a, quote, negative operation, unquote. I thought it was a positive case inferred from our observations about the origin of complex systems and information. How is it negative?
Yeah, I was speaking specifically in terms of intelligent design's apologetic impact. So I didn't see it as making a case for the Christian God, but I did see it as making a case against the sort of atheistic attempts to say that there is no God. So it's only in that sense. I mean, in terms of insights into biology, I see it as a very positive program. So, need to take it in the context in which I said it.
Okay. Very good. Another question here. Can ID distinguish, this is Rob, can ID distinguish between agency and mechanism? For example, identify what is a mechanism and what is the identity of the agent behind the mechanism.
Yeah.
Bill?
Okay. We have now large language models, ChatGPT, Grok, etc. I mean, they are, if you will, mechanisms, but they draw on agents in the text that they have produced. So there are what you might call derived intelligences that can operate mechanistically. But what you have to do then is trace the source back. And ultimately, with even these mechanisms that express intelligence, there's going to be, I would argue, an irreducible intelligence that's not reducible to mechanism. So there can be connections, but it's the mechanisms themselves can be intelligently designed and express intelligence, but so there are connections, but there's also a distinction.
Okay, we just got a few minutes here left, so I'm going to ask you maybe to respond to this. Both of you respond to this question. I know you have already to some degree, but the question is, how does ID practically impact our life today? Can it be used as a bridge to the gospel? Both of you touched upon that, but maybe you could summarize your thinking about that question.
Yeah, I'll go first real quickly. I think intelligent design, as Bill said, is can easily become part of Christian apologetics, and at least at minimum, help people to understand that the possibility of a creator is real. And I think when you incorporate intelligent design into a larger framework like our creation model at Reasons to Believe, you could even use it to propel forward towards, I think, a greater, stronger presentation of the credibility of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Bill.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at my own conversion, my dad was a biologist. He taught evolutionary biology. I grew up accepting it in broad strokes. I don't think I was ever an ardent Darwinist, but it was simply not an issue for me in my conversion. I mean, my conversion, I was into what at the time would nowadays be called more New Age thinking. And my big problem was, how could a perfect God relate to an imperfect human being? And I grew up nominally Catholic, and I remember explicitly rejecting that Jesus was God incarnate. And it was at that point in my life, though, that suddenly the light bulb went on, and then I realized that by God becoming human in Jesus Christ, that connection could be made, and that this greatest desire and need in my heart would be met. Okay, and so that was the results. That's what resulted in my conversion. So evolutionary thinking was not at all part of it, or its rejection in terms of design. But I think subsequently, I started, as a Christian, you're trying to understand the world. You're forming a worldview and getting clear on what God's design was for the world became something important in my Christian faith. But I think from an apologetic vantage, it's what are the questions people are asking? For not everyone is this going to be the burning question. There may be another question, but I think for some it is. I mean, I mentioned earlier about Lee Strobel losing his faith with the Miller-Urey experiment. I'm learning about the Miller-Urey experiment. It would have been good if somebody could have just taken him aside and said, this is what this experiment really shows. All you get is tars and things that have no sort of biological viability. And at most you get building blocks which still need to be put together. So this does nothing really to explain, it gets you the first step, but you've got a billion more steps that you need to take. And so, you haven't explained the origin of life. So I think to be able to deal with that, because for a lot of people, it does become a stumbling block. We want, I think, in our apologetics to remove stumbling blocks.
Well, guys, our time is up. I want to thank both of you. This is really an engaging discussion. So appreciate the contribution that both of you have made. I want to remind our audience that this is our RTB YouTube live stream. We've done a number of them in the past, interviewing different people who take different faith science positions. And I want to encourage you to tune in again. So thank you again. Bye-bye.